This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Why? Because some of the questions we get asked a lot are: how do you make your videos? Which software do you use? So to learn more about that, stick around after the verdict. Today we bring you Israel versus Iran. The two countries have a long history of threats and antagonism, yet they're not neighbors, making it hard for them to actually wage war against each other. So how powerful are their militaries? Iranian defense expenditure can be compared to Israeli one in several ways. Israel spends a greater share of its income on defense. Its spending is also overall greater. But due to much lower wages in Iran and most of weapons developed locally, the same amount of money goes further there to pay for soldiers, research and weapons. Still, that seemingly much bigger sum goes to upkeep a very large army, numbers-wise, as Iran is a much bigger country than Israel. Because of the long-standing international isolation of Iran, its military largely lacks high-tech systems, so the money is going mostly into large numbers of older weapons. Most importantly, a lot of the money goes into upkeeping two army organizations within Iran. There is the official army, which is largely made up of conscripts. Then there's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is tasked with upkeeping the Islamic Republic system, basically protecting them from outside interference, from coup d'etat and revolutions. Of course, in war, their forces too would add to the regular army, even though the army holds most of the heavy weapons. The first weapons used might be various long-range missiles. Those could fly over third-party states in between of the two belligerents, despite their protests. Iran has a great variety of ballistic missiles, though only a small number have the range required to reach Israel. Israeli ballistic missiles are either short-range tactical or large strategic ones, with no class in between. Since there is very little information on Jericho missiles, it is impossible to know whether some of them carry conventional warheads. There is high likelihood that all Jericho missiles carry only nuclear payloads. Otherwise, it would be a too expensive missile for a payload that has little effect. Especially Jericho 3 is unlikely to carry conventional warheads due to its range and flight path, which makes it harder to enjoy pinpoint precision. At best, a dozen of two Jericho 2 missiles may be used to attack Iran with conventional warheads. They likely have terminal radar guidance, much like US Pershing missiles, in addition to satellite guidance. Some Iranian missiles capable of reaching Israel are satellite-guided and could achieve decent precision. Still, with their roughly 1-ton warheads, they're not really more effective than a bomb. 100 or so bombs, assuming all hit Israel, would do negligible damage. The number of actual industrial or military targets in Israel is so big they would be just a drop in a bucket. They would be weapons of terror. Equally so, when it comes to damaging military or industry, Israeli Jericho missiles would be close to insignificant. Their most likely use would thus be against facilities which may help Iran develop nuclear weapons. Most of those are sprawling complexes, thousands of square meters in area, with a multitude of worthy targets. Some facilities are dug into the ground or under a mountain. While some would undoubtedly get destroyed, a fair chunk of facilities would survive. If Iran wants to develop nuclear weapons, the attack might set it back months or years, but it wouldn't be a permanent solution. Great majority of Israeli missiles would hit near their targets. Iran lacks anti-ballistic missile systems to intercept them. Malfunctions could happen to both sides, but a sizable number of Iranian missiles may get intercepted. Israel is one of the few countries in the world which developed and possesses anti-ballistic missile systems. Patriot and David's Sling are primarily anti-aircraft systems. David's Sling, being more modern, may be able to intercept a medium-range missile fired by Iran. Still, it is highly unlikely it would succeed, as it was made to tackle tactical ballistic missiles, not the very fast missiles Iran would use, which leaves the Arrow system as the one to count on. Still, as interception of a salvo of many missiles has never been attempted, it's hard to say how effective it would be. It has been tailored against missiles of Iranian arsenal though. A few dozen missiles intercepted might not be unrealistic, but 100 or so missiles striking Israel would still be insignificant for Iran. Further options for both sides would be cruise missiles. While both sides have air-launched missiles, their range is lacking, meaning planes would be put in danger while carrying them. Both sides do possess longer-range cruise missiles in small numbers. Given those small numbers, their usefulness is very limited. They would also be easier to intercept by regular air defense systems. Their warheads may be smaller than ones on ballistic missiles, and the penetration power would be lacking. Especially against select Iranian nuclear facilities, they would be a poor choice of a weapon. Air forces would thus have to be used if serious damage is to be dealt. Israel has a larger air force. More so, its planes are much more modern, overall bigger and more capable. There's also the question of distance. Actual combat range of an aircraft depends a lot on its payload and its flight altitude. Even if basic ferry range is the same, larger planes will be able to carry a large payload more easily than smaller planes. Israeli F-16s can use large external fuel tanks, but the plane is still limited by maximum takeoff weight, limiting total fuel and payload. F-16I can also use conformal fuel tanks, increasing its range further and in some cases matching it with F-15I. But all this assumes no allowance for maneuvering. If a plane needs to fight or evade missiles, it will have to burn more fuel. Those stated ranges will drop in realistic missions. The ranges also assume high-altitude flight, which is most fuel efficient. Realistically, planes may need to fly low when near a threat. A plane flying just over the ground may have its fuel consumption rise by more than 2 times. Let us review the ferry ranges of various fighters. F-15s and late model F-16s have ample range. Earlier F-16s fare a bit worse, but are still better than what Iranian planes can achieve. But given actual weapon loads and their effect on smaller planes, would mean combat radius table would look different. Most Iranian planes would lack range, even if rebased as close to Iran's western border as possible. Basically only 2 types could hope to use bombs. Some could use standoff missiles, but their missile inventory is very low. Iran is also very limited when it comes to in-air refueling. It has a single tanker, and most of the Iranian planes can't even benefit from it. F-4s might be topped up with fuel inside Iran as they reach cruise altitude. In best case scenario for Iran, their strike packages would consist of a few waves of half a dozen F-4s and Su-24s protected by half a dozen F-14s each, with a precursor attack of a half a dozen Mirage launching cruise missiles. Of course, they would be met by heavy Israeli resistance. Conserving fuel, Iranians would have to fly high to even reach Israel. Israeli ground radars and aerial early warning planes would detect them early on. Since fuel-saving subsonic flight would be the only option for Iranians, Israelis would have over half an hour to prepare the interceptors. Basically, it would be a slaughter. Dozens of ready-to-intercept Israeli fighters with modern radars and missiles against a dozen old F-14s and bomb-laden F-4s with decades-old sensors and missiles. Little to no Israeli planes would be lost, with close to 0 chances of any Iranian bombs reaching Israel. Slightly better chances for Iran might be had if they just used F-14s, topped up with fuel in the air and trying to fly low before approaching Israel. Still, a dozen F-14s, even if somehow not detected by Israeli planes in the air, would do very little damage with their unguided bombs, and would have next to no ability to defend themselves. Only some targets at the very border of Israel might be attacked. Whole mission would yield next to no effect, while most or all F-14s would be lost. So the only real option remain air-launched cruise missile strikes, which are few in numbers, and even those Mirage might be chased down and intercepted by Israelis. All this didn't even include Israeli SAM batteries. Suffices to say, Iranian air attacks would be suicidal if attempted, and could not be persisted with. Of course, all these airstrikes so far are not really realistic, because in the real world there are countries in between Iran and Israel. While they might turn a blind eye and let either side planes go through, they might also decide to simply intercept them. Going over Turkey or Saudi Arabia would pretty much be a no-go in such a situation, as both sides could mostly prevent any sort of meaningful strike to go through. Jordan doesn't have a powerful military, but it is still strong enough to cause either side losses that might outweigh the benefit of the attack. Its air forces and air defenses are pretty powerful, making it almost impossible for Iranians to fight through, and making it too costly for Israelis to keep striking through it to Iran. Jordan could be avoided though, and flights made over Syria. Its forces are exhausted due to the decade-long civil war, and would put up much less of a fight. Still, on paper, Syria does have a sizable air force, even if one assumes half of it wouldn't be able to fly, and its air defenses, while mostly old, are numerous. Still, it would be prudent to assume a large part of the older systems are not operational. That leaves Iraq as the one country that would definitely have to be overflown. While doable, it too would result in losses if Iraq decides to intercept. With countries interfering, Iran would have no chance of reaching Israel with its bombs or air-launched cruise missiles. But how would Israel fare? Again, if the less realistic option of neighboring countries letting them pass is considered, they would enjoy some success. Though only F-15s and F-35s could hope to carry meaningful bomb loads, without in-flight refueling. But Israel does have enough air tankers to refuel several dozen planes per strike wave. Even if refueled over Israel, their range would increase. Additional reach could be gained by using standoff weapons. With satellite and optical self-guidance, their precision would be considerable. Of course, Iranians would intercept. While they don't have AWACS-type planes, they do have numerous ground raiders, and their western border has high mountains, increasing their reach even against low-flying planes. Iranian air defenses would come into play. They're quite numerous, but some are of questionable capability. Israeli technological advantage would mean Iranian raiders would have a problem dealing with Israeli jammers. Thus, Israeli planes would likely fly high up, choosing extra reach instead of lowering enemies' reaction time. Still, the numerous SAM defenses and dozens of Iranian fighter jets intercepting would pose some threat. Due to length of Iranian western border, only a part of their defenses and interceptors could engage the Israelis, as Iranians would need to spread their assets around. Iranian Air Force is faced with low training hours, lack of spare parts and lack of modern weapons for their fighters. While Israelis might occasionally be swamped by more numerous opponents, even in those situations, exchange ratios would be heavily on Israeli side. Safest bet for Israel would be not to go far into Iran. That way little time would be given to Iranians to assemble numerous interception flights from various bases. Some losses would be assured though, especially if Israeli attacks keep repeating day after day. Better part of the losses might come from SAM systems. Overall result of a short campaign might see Israel losing a dozen or two planes, while downing several times as many Iranian ones, and striking various Iranian targets with hundreds of bombs and missiles. A protracted campaign may actually strain Iranians more, as they would keep losing more planes. But all that assumes Iranians do come out and protect their western border regions. Going farther into Iran and trying to repeatedly attack Tehran, for example, might cause Israelis unacceptably high casualties in the long run. Which is why the option of using tankers over other countries, even if they would allow it, is not terribly attractive. Though it might enable Israelis to use more fuel for combat, using afterburners, for example. But as with Iran, in the real world Israel might not enjoy free passage. Adding the losses from Jordan, Syria and/or Iraq would make the whole operation less worth the effort. Actually, going for a land invasion is out of the question. Countries in between would stop pretty much every such attempt, and the attacker would get bogged down in the desert while pretty much every other involved party would join in against them. In the real world, the war would likely be confined to missile strikes doing negligible damage. Iran would not attempt airstrikes. If Israel does attempt them, they would be limited to Iranian nuclear facilities in the western half of the country. Only with political support of neighboring countries would Israel go on a larger bombing campaign. Bottom line, Israel would fare a little bit better, but neither side would get significantly hurt. And if Israel ever decides to use its nukes, it would not even be a contest. Realistically, there is no reason for it to use nukes first though. But dozens of nukes could devastate Iran as a functioning country. So how did we put together all these little planes, the map and everything else? We used animation software. Our videos are done using Adobe After Effects. Now you might be saying, yeah, but I'm not an animator. Well, neither were we. You can actually see that our first videos were simpler. But using online learning lessons, anyone can learn to make videos such as ours. That's where Skillshare comes in. It's an online learning community. It has thousands of video classes covering animation, design, video editing and more. These classes in particular might interest you. After Effects for Beginners, where you can start learning the said software even if you have no experience whatsoever. Or Animating with Ease with After Effects, which covers some of the finer details you can achieve with the software. But Skillshare really covers a lot more. You can learn photography or even how to run a business. It is also more affordable than most other learning platforms. The annual subscription is less than $10 a month. Also, the first 500 people clicking below on the link in the video description will get a limited time offer by Skillshare, a 2-month free Skillshare Premium membership. Premium membership gives you unlimited access to quality classes held by experts in their fields. You can improve your skills and learn to do the work you love. So try it out! And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.